through. I just wanted to begin also by just reminding everyone that the intervention began in 2007. It was later revealed to be pretty much a political stunt in the lead up to an election, which makes the sorts of measures that were made from Canberra that affected the lives of people on the ground in the Northern Territory with no consultation with them, no respect for their wisdom and understanding about what works best, no respect for their own leadership and advocacy. So it was certainly a moment of great shame for Australia. Many of you might remember that in order to pass this package of legislation, it meant that the Racial Discrimination Act, the Anti-Discrimination Act in the Northern Territory and the Social Security Act had to be repealed to ensure that people grossly affected by these policies weren't able to complain about them. It took their voice away further, and I think was a good benchmark to say how against which to measure the reforms that were looked at in relation to land, housing, culture, language, education, and welfare reform. So I think it's also important to note that in subsequent years, particularly under Labor and under Jenny Macklin, that some of these reforms were doubled down on. They weren't improved, despite the growing evidence, which had been predicted by Aboriginal leaders across the Northern Territory. So I think it's important to maybe start with a bit of a snapshot about where we are now 13 years on. To do that, we're going to start with Dr. Stephen Gray, who's a senior lecturer at Monash University Faculty of Law and an associate to the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law. He's published widely on Indigenous legal issues and stolen wages, criminal law and Indigenous art and culture, so across the areas that were affected by the intervention. And he has been the lead researcher in an evaluation report called the Northern Territory Intervention and Evaluation that was published in February this year. So Stephen, can I hand over to you to talk through some of the key findings of the report and some of your observations about where we are now 13 years after the intervention?
Thank you, Larissa, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I'm speaking from, which is in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people, and also pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak here in front of all of so many eminent people and so many people who have fought very hard against the intervention. I actually don't want to speak for very long. I really would like to hand over to hear from First Nations people this evening. But yes, I at the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law, as Larissa mentioned, it's part of Monash University, so we focus on human rights issues. And several years ago, well, I actually lived in Darwin myself for about 15 years, so it came from that experience really. But we started to look at the Northern Territory intervention. I remember when it first came into force, and remember from living in Darwin how differently Indigenous people were seen by the majority non-Indigenous population. It seemed to be almost a smear, the way that whole thing was framed way back then. And I don't think it's improved fundamentally since then. So as Larissa mentioned, it began by repealing the Racial Discrimination Act, or at least changing, so amending it so that it didn't apply to Indigenous people, which in itself is an insult and had dramatic effects. And the Labor government, when it came into power, while it restored the operation of the Racial Discrimination Act on its face, it also said that the Northern Territory intervention is a special measure that's applicable. And so the idea behind this special measure was that it's meant to be something to improve the lives, something that's specially designed for Indigenous people. So anyway, we produced that first report in 2016, and the Northern Territory intervention had failed on so many measures, things to do with employment, so many of the things that it said it was going to do, basically, in terms of supposedly overcoming all the things that were meant to be wrong with the lives of Indigenous people. It had failed in areas of employment. It had failed in health and life expectancy. What we really focused on mainly was incarceration rates. That's Aboriginal imprisonment rates, which, as we all know, I'm sure have always been a national disgrace. And they haven't improved since the Northern Territory intervention. They haven't improved since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody back in the early 90s. In fact, they've got a lot worse. And I was very surprised that the NT intervention never even had it as a target, didn't focus upon this issue of incarceration rates, which is really crying out as a national shame. And so that's something that we tried to campaign on fairly hard. We kind of a bit of a marketing tool, I guess, but we scored the intervention on in between 0 and 10 as a way of kind of getting the general media, I guess, to be interested in some of these issues. And so often they are swept under the carpet. And we thought on incarceration rates that the intervention deserved this big fat 0 out of 10, and it really continues to be. So in the most recent version of the report, it hasn't improved on that front. Another area that we thought was very important was the income management regime, as I'm sure you would very well know. The part of the original intervention strategy was to bring in that discriminatory income management regime, which applied across the board to so many Indigenous communities around the Territory, and sequestered or took away a large percentage of Indigenous people. I think it was 50% of the original income management regime of income, and forced people onto this basics card, which was a humiliating kind of a thing for people to have to do. And that's still in operation, or it's actually been extended in the form of a cashless welfare card now. So that's something that we also think is important to fight against this idea that welfare can be extended in that way, or to be given out, I suppose, in such a humiliating way. So that was a couple of the issues that we spoke about. Another one was Indigenous customary law. The intervention took away the ability of courts in the Northern Territory to consider Aboriginal customary law in sentencing and in bail decisions. And that's, again, that's that's a discriminatory thing to do. Any other group of people in the Northern Territory or elsewhere are entitled to have their customs, their rules, their whatever you want to call them, everything that's relevant to the person who's being sentenced or who's up in a bail decision can be taken into account by a court, as it should, whether it's a positive thing or a negative thing. And yet, when it came to Indigenous people, the people who've been in this country for way longer, orders of magnitude longer than anybody else, the colonial authorities took away the ability of the courts to consider that customary law in making bail and sentencing decisions. So again, that's a pretty outrageous thing, and it's still essentially there. So we thought that was something as well that tried to draw the attention of the higher authorities to
this issue. And Stephen Gray, I hope not to put you on the spot too much, but I thought it might be good to come back to you now, just given Greg's overview of that specific aspect and history of the intervention. If there's anything you wanted to add that came from your report, and perhaps for people who are interested in accessing the report, how they can do that.
There's a link to the report on the Castan Centre, so that's the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law at Monash University. We didn't talk a great deal about the homelands in that that report we were focusing on. But I mean, as Greg has said, that's a really crucially important part of this whole issue, and maybe we should look at it more in the future. We spoke, as I mentioned earlier, about the customary law issue and the income management and cashless welfare card issue, but also more generally about the effects that the interventions had on these measures, what they call the closing the gap issues of health and life expectancy. And you would think that Indigenous life expectancy, Indigenous health would have improved with all the improvements in these areas for the general population over the last 15 years. And it's happened a little bit, but it hasn't happened anywhere near as much. And I'm sure that people who are here would know that really well. So I think all of these issues come together, and I think it's good that a forum like this is able to bring together things like the homelands and the issues that Greg has spoken about, and the other speakers, Harry, Uncle Harry, and I think it's hopefully we can get a kind of a group of these issues together so that it's like a something that we can lobby and speak about with a single voice rather than with lots of different voices. Maybe there are hopes for change in that way.
Thank you. Stephen, did you want to add anything after hearing everyone else's comments? Giving you a chance.
I was thinking when Auntie Barb was talking before about the police and the incident with Kumanjai Walker and how difficult it's going to be and how long it's going to take to get the trust of the community back in the police. And I don't think that most non-Indigenous people would really understand what that means and how this all relates to the history. And I guess the thing I would want to say is, and we've seen this Black Lives Matter, and we've seen, you know, the statues and this whole discussion about history, and the Prime Minister's ignorant comment about history just last week. It shows how little, you know, they actually understand about the real history of the country. And I guess when it comes to treaty and comes to these bigger issues, I think it's really important that non-Indigenous people, especially, I mean, Aboriginal people already know the history, but non-Indigenous people, I don't think have been taught that, and I don't think have really learned it as a whole. And I think it's really important that the country as a whole, and especially non-Indigenous people who don't know these things, learn about Aboriginal history.
Mm.